What if one day we could never play Halo again? The campaigns, the split screen, Forge, all of it just memories. You could watch videos of what it was once like, hear exciting stories of killionaires and zombie sprees, but it would never be the same. Newcomers and archivists alike would rely on hearsay rather than experiencing it firsthand. Thankfully, this is not the case. Classic Halos are available in various states using several techniques, but to what extent has it truly been preserved? Emulation, porting, remasters, all can deliver different variations of the same game. Some preserve the gameplay experience, while others preserve the social experience. Accuracy to the source material might be king, or perhaps it's about recreating a feeling. But then, a game is never truly finished. It goes through alphas and betas, then on release it has updates and DLC. So, which version of each Halo should we be protecting? Well, my name is Same Token, and today we'll be exploring what it means to preserve Halo. Video games are a unique medium in that they involve user interaction. Retellings, pictures, videos, no reproduction of a game can truly impart the full experience of physically playing the original. It'd be like reading a description of a song and saying that it's the same as listening to it. To not interact with video games would be to ignore what makes them so unique. Unlike books, which could be reproduced by picking up any print and rewriting it out, preserving games is another beast entirely. Video games are complex. They are artifacts with assets that can be stored and protected. But they're also behavioral and cultural models that can only be understood with context. Destiny's source code, for example, could be stored away indefinitely. Perhaps decades from now, it could be hosted on a home server. But as a multiplayer game, you'd never get the same experience as when it was released. Contexts change over time, and so part of preserving games is also preserving materials that explain the environment in which they existed. Yet, as the original hardware deteriorates and fails, fewer machines will exist that can run the games in their initial configurations. If left unchecked, we would lose entire swaths of gaming history. Thankfully, there are solutions, such as emulation, that allow classic games to run on newer hardware. Video game emulation allows the hardware of game consoles to be replicated. In many cases, this is done entirely through software, essentially making it possible to run a game console on your PC. At Macworld 1999, Steve Jobs demonstrated Apple's Power Mac emulating a PlayStation. Developed by Connectix, this software was using the Power Mac's G3 processor to recreate an entire platform fast enough for it to be playable. This was incredible at the time. Functional emulators of contemporary consoles were fairly novel in the mid to late 90s. But having said that, they were never perfect. Companies like Nintendo never published the technical specifications of their hardware, and so emulator developers had to reverse engineer the console's inner workings. And worse still, legal hurdles were cropping up. A Nintendo 64 emulator released in '99 became the first developed for a still-supported console. Fearing this would affect sales of the real hardware, Nintendo took legal action. Similarly, Sony filed a lawsuit against Connectix for that PlayStation emulator, and while this ultimately closed in favor of Connectix, Sony purchased their emulator so they could immediately discontinue it. Hardware companies have always feared third-party emulation, especially of new consoles. Perhaps they're concerned about the financial impact, or maybe their brand image for when the emulators perform poorly. Of course, this hasn't stopped the creation of many highly functional emulators. DOSBox can play classics like Doom and Wolfenstein 3D. PCSX2 runs PS2 games, and there's even an Xbox 360 emulator called Xenia. However, third-party emulators still do have their limits, and some are a little tricky to set up for the average consumer. With that in mind, if you're not an enthusiast, is there a way to have your cake and eat it, mixing ease of use with performance? Well, that's exactly what first-party emulators attempt to achieve. Sony's backwards compatibility between the first PlayStation and PS2 was amazing, because they shared similar components. And it was a similar story with the first generation of PS3s, which essentially had PS2s inside. But this solution couldn't last forever, otherwise the PS5 would have 5 entire consoles inside. That is where hardware vendors have a slightly more positive stance on emulation, when they do it themselves. Instead of housing an entire PS2, later PS3 units included a PS2 emulator. But just as Sony giveth, Sony taketh away. The release of a slim model saw PS2 emulation removed entirely for the original discs. Suddenly, it became a little harder for the average consumer to find official ways of running their old PS2 library. A small list of PS2 games were resold on the PlayStation Store with compatibility for newer console models, and Sony's PS Now streaming service hosts a slightly larger collection. If the game you wanted to play wasn't available on either of these services, it became a choice of holding on to the original hardware for as long as possible, or using third-party emulation tools. Microsoft has taken a similar approach, though in recent years, they fared a little better in the not making you buy your old games again department. They are the kings of backwards compatibility. While companies like Apple are happy to prune away legacy features, such as 32-bit support, Microsoft's Windows has terrific interoperability with older systems. A culture that was carried over to the Xbox team, evidenced with the Xbox 360 initially supporting around 200 original Xbox games using software emulation, which was eventually increased to almost half of the original Xbox library. Not quite the near-complete legacy support on the early PS3s. Yet, this was a clear indication Microsoft recognized the importance of making classic titles easily accessible. While it's a huge shame that a fair number of games were left out, Halo Combat Evolved and Halo 2 were fortunately both on that backwards compatible list. All you gotta do is stick your original Halo discs into your Xbox 360, download an update, and you're away. In fact, during the Xbox 360's lifetime, you could play every single Halo on the one console. However, this was foiled with the release of the Xbox One in 2013. Initially, it had no backwards compatibility. This meant you had to keep a hold of your Xbox 360 if you wanted to play Halo at all. Eventually, support for both legacy consoles trickled in, including all Halo titles on the Xbox 360. Yet, this wouldn't happen until 2017, perhaps because Microsoft had alternative plans for Halo. Instead of emulation, which involves mimicking the hardware of an older system, the game itself can be ported to contemporary systems so that it may run natively. As is the case with most classic PC games, many of which can still run natively thanks to Windows legacy support and various updates, this often removes any form of bottleneck that comes with emulation. Enter Microsoft's plan for Halo, the Master Chief Collection. Rather than emulate the original Halos, players could run them natively on the Xbox One. This had already been done before with Combat Evolved Anniversary, which saw the original Halo engine running on the Xbox 360 without emulation. You see, one of the benefits of porting over emulation is that you're able to more easily tinker with the game at its source, rather than tackling something that's already been compiled. Thanks to this, Saber Interactive was able to build on the original engine to create the Anniversary assets. And Halo 2 was also given this treatment using a similar process. Along with ported versions of Halo 3 and 4, this was all wrapped up in the Master Chief Collection. It was a great deal, a brilliant bundle of games that received many quality of life improvements over the originals. But it wasn't without its issues. Halo the Master Chief Collection was released in 2014 and included the first 4 Halo games and their downloadable content. Fan favorites in a single package. What could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a lot as it turned out. The MCC's launch was mired with issues, especially in matchmaking. But over time, 343 Industries did a wonderful job fixing up those issues and giving us far more than we could have hoped for, including bringing almost all the Halos to PC. Back in 2007, this would have sounded like pure fantasy. Classic Halos were given a new breath of life. When the original Xbox's servers shut down in 2010, Halo 2's matchmaking was no longer accessible. New fans of the series would never again have been able to truly experience all Halo 2 had to offer. Then, the Master Chief Collection came along and brought back Halo 2's online multiplayer. In fact, the multiplayer from all the classic Halos return, wrapped up in a fantastic playlist system that allows you to make highly specific matchmaking requests. Gameplay was altered in small ways too. Keyboard and mouse support was eventually added for the PC release, a first for many of the included games. And a new toggleable aiming mode was introduced for controllers. You see, in classic Halos, as you turn your head, there are inconsistencies in acceleration between certain angles. This new, modern aiming mode corrects this, making Halo feel like other contemporary first-person shooters. For example, tracking this diagonal line is now far smoother when compared to the legacy controls. And of course, on the graphics end, we saw a huge bump from the original 640p 30fps all the way up to 1080p 60 across the board. In the latest updates, the Master Chief Collection now sports a field of view slider, 4K support, and enhanced graphics on the PC and faster Xbox models, which ever so slightly tweaks the look of the original games. Notwithstanding, one discrepancy still remains. The Master Chief Collection may have ported Combat Evolved and Halo 2 to newer hardware, but unlike the others, these Halos did not come directly from their console releases. Instead, they were taken from their PC ports, essentially making the first 2 Halos in the collection ports of ports. And sadly, Combat Evolved for PC was technically inferior. As discussed by Late Night Gaming, the lighting was broken. Bump maps were only visible through dynamic lights, like the player's torch, meaning scenes appear to have less depth when compared to the original. Plus, transparency shaders received a fairly stark downgrade. And this was the version of Combat Evolved used as the foundation for its anniversary revamp, which in turn means it's the version preserved by the Master Chief Collection. Of course, these issues are mitigated when using the Anniversary Graphics mode, though that may not be to everyone's taste, and it's certainly not the original Halo. Fortunately, 343 are now actively working to fix these issues, bringing the first Halo closer to its initial console release. The May 21st beta update has improvements to those bump maps and shaders. Just look at the difference from before and after the update. And now compare it to the original. You'll see that everything is more in line with how it should look. This perhaps now makes the Master Chief Collection one of the best ways to play Combat Evolved. Overall, these updates do provide a far slicker and more modern Halo experience, but this video is about preserving Halo. At what point does modifying the original experience with field of view sliders and control enhancements counteract preservation? Remastering video games can be a tricky business. often far more complex than other mediums, like movies. In terms of visual quality, classics like Goodfellas, Alien, and The Thing hold up pretty well. Yes, they don't have HDR or Dolby Atmos, and they look and sound a little different from modern films, but the equipment used doesn't really distract from their content. When it comes to remastering, sometimes it's just a case of going back to the original film, rescanning it all at a higher resolution, then using various digital restoration techniques to remove any degradation. Now, while things like CGI can age a film, all video games begin to show their age very quickly. Low poly assets, janky animations, low resolution textures, and in earlier cases, even a lack of floating point precision, which gave PS1 games that shaky look. Perhaps this is becoming less of an issue, but very old games may be less palatable to a modern audience. That's where remastering comes in. Especially useful in ongoing franchises, altering legacy games for the appreciation of modern audiences means they can often be repackaged and resold as new. This could be as simple as adding things like widescreen, 4K, and 60 FPS support and calling it a day, or as advanced as recreating textures and assets. The Master Chief Collection does both. Combat Evolved and Halo 2 have new assets along with their original games, and the rest enjoy smaller improvements. However, there is a debate as to whether remastering is really a good thing. For CNET, Dan Ackerman suggested it could be comparable to colorizing black and white movies, which in the past has been considered vandalism by some critics. Similarly, Star Wars faced criticism when its creator, George Lucas, went back and altered the originals. Halo Combat Evolved was designed to run at no higher than 480p 30 frames per second, or 576i 25 FPS for PAL territories, though that introduced a couple of issues which forced them to change the speed of certain game elements. Thus, the NTSC version is still considered the optimal way to play the original Halo. Now, we're pushing this all the way to 4K and higher. Ackerman proposed that it may be better to experience games as they were originally intended. However, in the case of the first Halos, that would involve everyone somehow getting their hands on an original Xbox. And without technical knowledge, how long will these consoles last before they could never play Halo the quote-unquote right way again? Therein lies the difficulty of balancing preservation with accessibility. Ideally, Halo will be preserved in its original state for as long as possible somewhere, but in preventing degradation, actually playing it would have to be kept to a minimum. Therefore, I think preservation can mean far more than that. Without the original hardware, we really are only left with two options: porting and remastering, or emulation. The Master Chief Collection may have breathed new life into the classic Halos, but perhaps we should look into whether there's a limit to how far remasters and ports of old games should go. For PC Gamer, Natalie Clayton wrote an article titled, "I wish 343 would leave Halo the Master Chief Collection alone." They felt as though it's becoming a shoddy live service game, with Halo 3 receiving additions like new cosmetic skins and maps that were pulled from Halo 4 and Halo Online. Granted, there are issues with updating these old games, especially when dealing with new features. For example, a recent update accidentally altered Halo 3's lighting, causing small lights to disappear at higher field of view settings. However, issues like this can all be patched, and most of the new features can be toggled off anyway. Although the article acknowledges this, they express displeasure in the idea that, in addition to preserving Halo, 343 decided to add service elements to drive engagement. Honestly, they have a point. After all, these progression systems for unlocking armors and skins never existed in the classic Halos. But then, we also didn't have a playlist system that could tap into any Halo we wanted at any time. And this all assumes purity of experience is the best course for preserving Halo. Perhaps the Master Chief Collection shouldn't be considered a true preservation effort anyway. That isn't to say they're ruining the original games. Instead, it could be considered a Halo entry in its own right, worthy of preservation just as much as the originals. Those features that were created to drive engagement are important purely because they do drive engagement. We won't be able to enjoy packed Master Chief Collection lobbies forever. There may come a point, as with the classics, where matchmaking slowly dies. Games are rarely static. Like most modern software, they're constantly being updated, patched, and improved. In that sense, a game is never truly finished. Thus, it becomes a question of which game state to preserve. Alphas, betas, initial release, patches, expansion packs, DLC? In a way, they're all important. So maybe a game's entire history should be preserved, regardless of when each update occurred. Look at Id's Doom. Despite being released in 1993, 23 years later, co-creator John Romero would release several new levels. You could argue that these additions have become a part of the original Doom's history. Equally, updates and additions to the original Halos are now important parts of their history. Considering the Master Chief Collection as its own entity, rather than purely a preservation effort, brings us back to emulation as the best way to preserve the experiences of Halo's first editions. One day, years from now, perhaps we'll be emulating the Master Chief Collection on some futuristic ARM-based chip. Maybe it'll be running directly on our phones. Earlier, I touched on the convenience of emulation. Hardware can only last so long outside of protective environments, and so emulation can be used to make old software and games available to the masses. Of course, there is still a question of purity. Emulators can enhance certain aspects of old games, such as increased resolution. For a long time, Halo was not included in the Xbox One's backward compatibility list. That is until 2017. An update bringing emulation of the Xbox 360 Halos saw Halo 3, which was originally rendered at 640p, brought all the way up to almost 4K on the faster Xbox One X models. To be clear, unlike the Master Chief Collection, this was the original Halo 3 running at almost 4K. However, perhaps playing on a different resolution isn't fully capturing the real original experience, but it certainly leans closer towards preservation than a remaster. It also shows Microsoft cares about maintaining old games. Even though the Master Chief Collection was still making money, they decided to upgrade the old copy of Halo 3. What they have achieved here is phenomenal. Xbox 360s have a completely different hardware architecture from the Xbox One. Yet through backwards compatibility, they are often pushing equal, if not better performance than the originals. But there are two sides to this. Emulation that is not one-to-one with its source may still have differences in appearance or the way it feels. Not so much a problem with the emulation of software tools, such as with Apple's Rosetta during their transition to Intel. And now from Intel. Any hang-ups would be frustrating, but their purpose is for utility rather than preservation. That's where console emulation differs. It does exist to preserve, and we're often handling works of art created to be played in a certain way. Small variations, like microstutters, game-breaking bugs, or audio and visual glitches, will impact the experience. Now, you'd think these things would be exclusive to third-party emulators created through reverse engineering, but even Microsoft's own efforts have previously experienced problems. Halo 2, emulated on the Xbox 360 for instance, has a rather nasty visual artifact that freezes over the display. And on that note, with official emulation, we are at the mercy of hardware manufacturers and IP owners. During the Xbox 360 era, Microsoft offered fantastic legacy support. I mean, around half of all original games were compatible with the 360. The Xbox One eventually enjoyed similar brilliant support for emulating Xbox 360 titles. but its compatibility with original Xbox games took a dive to similar levels as Sony's PS2 support on modern consoles. Fortunately for Halo, it's a popular Microsoft IP, so we can expect continued legacy support for the foreseeable future. At least for the most part. You see, the first two Halos are not compatible with the Xbox One onwards. Although we can enjoy them with the Master Chief Collection, as mentioned before, emulation through backwards compatibility can offer a slightly purer experience, even if it is just to keep a record of an old game that revolutionized its genre. Overall, truly preserving a game might be an effort in compromise. If we were to keep the old Halos exactly as they were, maybe fewer people would have been willing to play it online, especially when it comes to newer fans. And without enough people playing, its matchmaking would be almost impossible to experience anyway. Alternative unofficial solutions do exist for purists. Specialized tunneling software like X-Link Kai can be used with the Xbox to create virtual LANs so you can play over System Link. That way you can still experience Halo 2 with people across the world, despite the original Xbox Live shutting down. And then there's always third-party emulation. However, that comes with its own caveats. Emulation of newer consoles is hard, especially for small development teams without the resources of behemoths like Sony and Microsoft. So when it comes to the 7th generation consoles and above, getting anything running is incredibly impressive. The open source emulator for the Xbox 360, Xenia, doesn't have the same performance as Microsoft's in-house emulation, but it is a huge leap in the right direction. Currently, despite its hiccups, it can run the original Halo 3 on PC surprisingly well, all things considered. For curiosity and preservation's sake, these kinds of emulators are an important consideration, though they remain legally very murky. While reverse engineering may be acceptable in some jurisdictions, emulation is limited by copyright law, DMCA, and the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, and that is just in the US. It's good then that Microsoft created brilliant emulators for the original Xbox and Xbox 360 that work on newer consoles seamlessly. However, it would be ideal if exceptions were made so everyone could experience important pieces of gaming history for many years to come. And that would include preserving Halo. Ultimately, I like what the Master Chief Collection achieved. But I also wish for backwards compatibility's continued support, offering an easily accessible yet well-preserved version of the classic Halos. And with that in mind, I'd love to see Combat Evolved and Halo 2 added to backwards compatibility in newer Xboxes. Yes, even emulation is not the same as playing them on release, especially with the One X's update pushing Halo 3 to 4K resolution. However, particularly in the case of matchmaking, it's unfortunately impossible to truly experience Halo as it was back in the day. Not only because of the low population numbers, but also because Halo's Xbox Live servers on the Xbox 360 are shutting down at the end of 2021. Just as the Noble 14 went down in gaming history as the last to play Halo 2 online, we are nearing the same end for Halo 3, Reach, and 4. Now is the last opportunity to record the matchmaking of Legacy Halo 3. And hopefully, anyone who has recordings from back in the day keeps them safe as they document an important part of gaming history. Unlike preserving software tools where minute differences may matter less, games are art, and so noticeable changes would be like altering a painting or a song. So fundamentally, the best solution for preserving Halo is to have it all. We need to protect the original hardware on all versions of the original copies for as long as possible. Halo's backwards compatibility should be maintained, and after Microsoft throws in the towel, it would be ideal if the source code was passed over to the fans, or at least archivists, so they may support emulators. And finally, the Master Chief Collection is an excellent way to experience the original games. While it's even further removed from the originals than emulation, it's close enough. If you don't like the new features, most of them can be toggled off, and best of all, its multiplayer is still active. Honestly, that is perhaps a large reason why we're seeing all these updates. Maintaining the classic Halo population is important, as it certainly won't last forever. Someday, Halo the Master Chief Collection itself will be a legacy game in its own right. Preserving games like Halo Infinite may become even more complex, with it potentially being the last Halo for the next decade. New campaigns will be added, and there's even talk of graphics improving over time across the board. After a certain point, it may look quite different from how it did on release. So, how will each state of Halo Infinite be preserved? How will we look back across all its versions decades from now like we can with the classic Halos? It is important to consider preservation sooner rather than later. There have been stories of developers, perhaps without realizing, taking some of the game's source code home, only for it to become essential when the game is being pieced back together decades later. It is in the public interest for the process and release of these works of art to be preserved, and Halo is no exception. So, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe and hit the bell icon for more. Stay safe out there, and I'll catch you next time.